All right, so my name is Jesse, and I am the lead on the Conservation Stories Canada project, where over 2021, I'll be heading out to every province and up to the territories to feature conservation stories in action across the country, coast to coast. In the lead up to that, as you've seen on the YouTube channel, I've been doing a whole slew of digital interviews with some of Canada's rising stars in conservation and some of the more established, coolest names in the country. And our speaker today very much fits that bill. Dr. Adam Ford's joining me from the Wildlife Restoration Ecology Laboratory at UBC Okanagan. And basically over the last 5 years, whenever I've chatted to someone involved in conservation in the country, they've either worked with Adam, highly respect Adam, or involved with something that he got a chance to do. So it's a real pleasure for me to meet you today, Dr. Ford, and thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jesse. It's great to connect.
Awesome. So with wildlife restoration ecology, restoration is a term that I keep hearing bandied about in a lot of these interviews. And I mean, I think we all sort of get the basic essence of it, but what does that look like in Canada? How do you begin to understand an ecosystem to the point where you know you need to restore it? And when you know you need to restore it, how do you go about doing that? Which I guess is a big question.
It is a huge question. And to be honest, I'm still learning about what it means. So fortunately, we have this sort of broad recognition that restoration has reached a new level of importance for the whole world. It's the UN decade of ecosystem restoration currently, and that kind of gives us a lot of attention to sort of think about and how to act on ideas around restoration. And I should say, like, there is no sort of single one-size-fits-all version of what restoration is. It's constantly changing. There's a deep philosophical and theoretical component and sort of conceptual sort of discussions in the literature about what it means to restore, and things like rewilding and what does that mean and how does that overlap or build on restoration, what we know about restoration. So I think it's a model that is very fuzzy. You know, it's an idea that that isn't so concrete and black and white. It can mean a lot of things. So one of the ways that we think about restoration, I guess I'll start with what a common or a conventional view of restoration is. And that's sort of thinking about the composition of species in a given area. You'll see this come up with like sort of post-operations industrial project like mitigations, like mine closures or pipeline rehabilitation. And there's often legal policies where people are obligated to restore the land to an equivalent land capability. And that may mean it has the potential to grow back to a boreal forest after it was, mined, which means often that people are looking for things like, are there shrubs growing? Is there woody cover being reestablished in this area? They're not looking to see if there's a forest, but is there sort of the essence of a forest or the potential to be a forest? Because they're not going to wait around, 50 to 100 years to check off if that site has been rehabilitated. They're just looking at the trajectory towards sort of recovery. Yeah. So that's kind of like the easiest definition. And you'll see things like invasive weed removal and tree planting is a common one, or, doing some work with a bank stabilization or something in a stream. There's a few different versions of this, like very conventional, structural focused idea of what restoration means. Yeah. And that's not really what we do too much of.
I'm really, you talked about the fact that you look at what a potential for a future forest is. And I love this idea because it takes it back to, real wilderness. And when I was a kid, that was what we thought of. We thought about, pure, virgin, untouched forest or coral reefs or whatever. And the more I do these interviews, the more the indication seems to be that that sort of thing doesn't really exist anymore. People impact every landscape. And so we're restoring something. Is there sort of an idealized thing that we're trying to compare it to or get it to? Or is it like the next best thing, the next level up? How do we make those decisions? And do we consider that sort of thing when we're doing this sort of work?
Yeah, I mean, that question is kind of at the heart of how people think about restoration. Like, what's success mean? So one of the definitions of restoration is the assisted recovery of an ecosystem. So it invokes this idea that humans must intervene. That is part of the restoration idea. It's not just hands off. Now, with respect to kind of what you're talking about, the idea of wilderness is I think, not only a problem now because it's hard to find,
Yeah.
but it was probably something that hasn't really existed for a long time.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about tens of thousands of years. People have long sort of interacted and manipulated the environment. That is something that most of the animals and plants that we recognize today have evolved through landscapes that were shared with people.
Yeah.
And so the idea that people are vacant from the land is sort of the ideal version of what we should restore to is really discounting the historical legacy of Indigenous people and their relationships with the environment. And so I think like a more updated way of thinking about restoration is moving past this idea of keeping people out and, national parks that don't allow, or protected areas that sort of exclude people or have forcibly removed people to create protected areas is really not where I think we need to go in terms of conservation and restoration. What we need to do is bring the relationships back to people, is to reconnect people with the environment and restore relationships rather than just the composition of species.
Yeah. I love that message, and certainly going through some of the work that you've done on social media, on your website, with your lab, and some of the colleagues you've worked with. Coexistence is this big term. It's this idea that sort of permeates everything that you do, and so we've talked about some of these broad philosophical questions with regards to restoration, but let's dive in with something that's a little more concrete, which is coexistence of individual wildlife species and people. And I know that, like, in East Africa, we think of elephants and rhinos and lions and how they coexist with people. What are the animals where that's the case in Canada, where, people and communities are impacted by the presence of these animals, and you really need to boil down to the nitty gritty examples of how they can coexist? Are there creatures like that, near where you are or in the country?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's funny you say that. Is like I had this idea of coexistence in my website since I was early days of my PhD. And I was focusing on food webs in East Africa. And there I was thinking of coexistence from a community ecology perspective. Yep. And there's this old paper that, used to talk about, like, how can there be so many species in the same area? And that is a community ecology question of coexistence. These animals are eating some of the same foods. And so how do they work that out, that they can coexist on this, like, in the same area but eat the same food? I mean, that science doesn't like that idea. And then what I sort of did was drag that idea with me into this sort of conservation world a little bit more, and thinking about coexistence as something that occurs between people and wildlife as well. And the coexistence with, say, elephants and people in parts of Kenya where I worked was not that easy. Like, it was a lot of work. There was fences, there was all sorts of technology that people were bringing in, and pretty important social dynamics that were bringing people and elephants into contact. And a lot of those same lessons are very active in Canada today. In our area, like, we're talking about urban deer as a challenge, and certainly with carnivores, we have a project on human-wolf coexistence in Pacific Rim National Park, where there's a strong mandate from Parks Canada to have a safe park for people. They don't want people getting hurt by animals within reason, and they don't want wolves to be hurt from managers trying to protect people. So there has to be a way through that sort of space in which we want people to be there, but also have a mandate for animals to be there, to find a way to coexist. And there's a part where humans have a role to play in not conditioning animals to be comfortable around them. There's a lot of, like, food conditioning that can happen, and that can lead animals into all sorts of trouble. So Pacific Rim specifically was a leader in creating these sort of bear-proof campsites, and that's something that we're greatly familiar with across most of Canada now. But that starts with looking at what are the sort of underlying food web related challenges with bringing animals and people together to cause conflict. That's what happens, is we animals want the same spaces we do. They maybe want the same foods as we do. And from that, it's very much a community ecology food web model of looking at how organisms share space and share resources. Grizzly bears are probably another great example of some of the work we've done in our group. And yeah, it's tough to be a grizzly bear around people. And they're doing their best from their behavioral perspective and evolutionary perspective to adapt to people. And I know in some communities, it is a major part of the like municipal development planning to figure out a way of accommodating wildlife in and around the municipal boundaries. Other communities are for whatever reason, sort of less comfortable with the presence of some animals. And that urban deer thing I was mentioning too. Yeah. We have a major mule deer project going here in southern British Columbia. And when I mentioned we're doing mule deer to some of my colleagues, they go, mule deer, like they're all over the place in Kelowna. Why, who cares, and so there's this erosion of their social value when we have nuisance animals, but that's a handful of animals living around people's gardens and giving their cedars a hard time or whatever. But out in the forest, in the land surrounding Kelowna, it's a different story.
Yeah. Well, cedars are going to have a hard time no matter what. I've never seen a tree that dies more readily on people's property, so we're not going to worry too much about them. I'm going to get back to deer in a minute because I love deer, and I think it ties nicely into some of the other stuff that you've worked on. But bear-proof campsites. So I've camped a lot in Ontario, and I mean, when you go to the park, there's information about bears. There's like how you tie your food up if you're in a backcountry campsite. Is that the essence of this, or is there something more to it than that? I just want to make sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's I can't remember what the latest SciComm is on this, but Parks Canada and other agencies have done a great job in trying to keep campgrounds clean. So you can't leave your cooler on a picnic table and go for a day hike and come back and like that's not a responsible way of managing that space. And it doesn't take much of teaching an animal that there's food available before it'll come back again. And so the best way is to just keep the options limited for animals. If they do wander through a campground, you just want them to keep on going and keep out of trouble. And yeah.
So that messaging really does have a big impact. I mean, certainly for me, I wouldn't leave a cooler out on a table, but I remember as a kid we did, and we drove back in from a day hike, and there was a raccoon sitting with his hand in our cereal box, just eating it, and he was totally shocked with the headlights when we came in. So these messages really do have an impact, and I love the sort of public responsibility element to this. This is something where it's conservation organizations, it's industry, it's people all working together to make sure that these are as positive as possible. And so, you mentioned mule deer, you mentioned deer in general. And so for me, one of the biggest experiences I ever had of poor wildlife interactions was driving through the US. In Ontario, I've seen maybe 1 or 2 dead deer on the side of the road my entire life. And I drove through Pennsylvania and New York, and I saw 17 dead deer and a dead bear in about 3 hours, which was shocking to me. And so I know that one of the things that your lab has worked on is these wildlife corridors, which are a way that you prevent these sort of collisions from happening. It's been a feature of a few of my interviews, and your lab specifically talks about some of the research about the effectiveness of them. So what is the effectiveness of them? I mean, are they working? Are there a way to make them better with that knowledge that we've gained? Are we making them better across the country? What's going on?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it seems like nowadays there's a wildlife crossing structure, an overpass or an underpass in every state and province in North America and a lot of countries in Europe. It's an exciting time to see that adaptation or the adoption of that technology. And they're not cheap, but it's reflecting a new way of thinking about our highways and transportation infrastructure. So it's nice to see the growth, and with that we get more opportunities to understand how they work in different contexts. And Banff National Park was sort of a pioneer in developing crossing structures and other highway mitigation technologies. This came around in the late 80s, the mid 80s with the expansion of the Trans-Canada Highway through the park. And there were some concerns back then that there's a stretch of highway between Canmore and Banff that was known as the meat grinder or something like that. It was really hard for both people and elk to be in that area. So the early days, there wasn't a lot of lessons to build on. They had to sort of roll the dice and experiment with a few different structural designs. And to their credit, they just went for it. They didn't know what the answers were, and they tried different configurations. They tried staggering the crossings, so that it wasn't just one long tunnel underneath a 4-lane highway, but there was sort of a tunnel then the animal would go into between the two, between the lanes, and then it would kind of zigzag out the other side, because they thought maybe if we broke up the sight lines, it would be more appealing. They tried cheaper culvert designs with sort of cement box culverts and just all sorts of stuff. And that was all before overpasses. And so it was pretty effective. The fences the fence is the part that reduces the roadkill, and the crossing structures are there to ensure we have connectivity across the highway. Though in the early days of the Trans-Canada, they put the crossing structures in because they didn't want the elk to go into the town of Canmore. If they put a fence up right across, they thought, well, we can't create a problem for the province, so we have to get our parks elk across the highway within the park itself. So they built some of these underpasses as a way of facilitating movement. But yeah, no, there's like hundreds of thousands of crossings by different species of animals in Banff, and that's just one stretch of highway. The overpasses tend to be preferred by species that typically like more open habitat types, like wolves and grizzly bears. Black bears and cougars seem to be more comfortable with the underpasses. We found different work. Some of our work showed how different sort of sex and age classes within a population might prefer different crossing structures. So there is a lot of nuance, but the short message is, yeah, they work fantastic.
Yeah,
they're great.
How cool is that? I mean, I've had the chance to drive that highway in Banff, and it is, I guess you're supposed to be looking at all the beautiful mountains, and I was just like, what a handsome wildlife crossing. So they have done a great job. I'm really excited to head there in person. It's one of the stories that I'm really keen to tell because it's such a beautiful example of conservation in action. So thank you for some of the backdrop story there. I mean, this is a perfect lead into the final question, which is, one of the big essences of this project for me is highlighting positive stories. I think that we're completely overwhelmed with the scale of the problem, and it is. There's a lot of threats facing wildlife around the globe. This is not a time to be complacent. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. But I love highlighting these positive stories of sort of conservation in action, doing some real good. So we covered the wildlife corridors. Is there anything that in your work you've seen to wrap us up that is also a really, a great stalwart success story that people could emulate in other parts of the country?
Well, there are a lot. I mean, I guess it depends on what kind of scale and what's the measure of success. I mean, one measure of success that we see in our work is when communities from different walks of life come together to work on a problem together. Our Mule Deer project is a great example of that, with different NGOs coming on board, different governments, different levels of government, different agencies within government, which you'd be surprised how hard it is to kind of get people coordinated within a government. And yeah, different universities are involved. So I love these like monthly calls we have, and everybody's got something to offer, and we work collaboratively to solve problems. It's pretty exciting. Yeah. And, I think that's gonna change the course of how we think about some of these species like mule deer. Some animals that people like to hunt are often like kind of written off, I think, by the conservation community. They're seen as the purview of hunters, and I think that's a big problem when we're talking about how to build community around wildlife management. Caribou are a mixed bag as well, and there's some really exciting stuff happening in central British Columbia. The West Morbidly and Salto First Nations are doing sort of national level leadership in creating a new way of supporting caribou through Indigenous-led conservation. And it's super exciting to see. So there's some folks in the lab working on that, and it's just so inspirational, to see. Instead of waiting for things to happen, just saying, what, this is within our like the deep roots of our culture to take care of this land. We're just going to, it's time for us to go for it. And, I think we're learning a lot from those nations about how we can be better conservationists. And part of that is we've measured declines for a long time. There's a lot of bad things out there that are driving the declines of wildlife. What can we learn about putting things back together or restoring them? So that's kind of where the inspiration for the lab name came from. Is it's time to try to fix things, and that doesn't mean going back to 1800 or 1500 or 900 AD or something. It means let's restore these relationships and critical flows and food web dynamics in ecosystems, given that it's 2021. But it's past time that we sort of fix things, and let's get everybody together and get some work done.
I could not think of a better message to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. Ford. I really appreciate you spending some time with